Hi, I'm T, and welcome back to Great Clacton's Ask a Pastor. And we are right now in the middle of a series looking at questions about the Bible. And today we'll be doing part 2 of the question of who wrote the books of the Old Testament. Now, this is going to be the last Ask a Pastor for the calendar year, because starting next week, we are into Advent. And there'll be a whole load of other things going on at the church, both online and in person during Advent. So we're winding down Ask a Pastor for now. But don't worry, we will be back sometime in the new year. So not at the very start, but early on in January, probably mid-January. We'll be back and we'll be continuing looking at questions about the Bible, because there's still a lot of ground we haven't covered. And I'll just say up front that if you have any questions that you would like to have answered, you can email me or Mark, or you can leave a message in one of, really below this video. Would be the best place to do it, because I'll definitely see that, and we will try to incorporate any of those other questions next term when we are back. And they could be about the Bible, or it could be about anything that you've got on your mind, and we will get to those eventually. So, as I said, we are talking about, we're answering the question of who wrote the books of the Old Testament. And last week we looked at who wrote the law, the Torah, and who wrote the histories. And so this evening we're going to be looking at the wisdom literature and the prophets. Now, the wisdom literature starts with Job, and we don't actually know who wrote the book of Job. Jewish tradition actually says that the book of Job was written even before the time of Moses, and if that's true, that means that Job is the oldest book in the Bible, written before anything else. And it's interesting that Job was not a Hebrew. He's not one of the Israelites. He was an Arab. So it actually shows that knowledge of the one true God was not exclusive to God's chosen people, the Israelites. But there are other people around the world who know and understand that there is a one creator God who is a personal God, who makes himself known to us and cares about what our relationship is with him and with each other. After Job, we have the Psalms. The Psalms really are songs of praise, and there are 150 of them, broken up into 5 different books. And more than any other book in the Bible, the Psalms were written by many different people at many different times. It's really it's a collection of different songs from different times that all have the purpose of expressing faith in God. And some of them really are songs of praise, but some of them are songs of frustration or anger or sorrow, or really any emotion you can think of, you'll probably find somewhere in one of the Psalms. And a lot of them will not say who wrote it. In fact, none of the Psalms in the song itself says who wrote it. Most songwriters don't do that. But titles have been attached to many of the songs, and in the title, when the author is known, that will be put down, that it is a song of such and such a person. But as I said, many of the Psalms just don't have any name attached to them. And even the names that we do know, there's a very large chance that those people whose name might be attached to some Psalms might have also written some of the other ones, and just their name never got attached to it, so we don't know that it's one of theirs. But the people that we do know who wrote the Psalms are, well, first of all, Moses himself was said to have written one of the Psalms, that's Psalm number 90. But the one individual who wrote more Psalms than any other is King David, who even before he was king was a musician. He wrote 73 of the Psalms that we know about. In particular, and this is important, I think, in sort of affirming that the Bible is correct in saying that these Psalms were written by David is that Jesus himself in the New Testament affirms that at least Psalm 110 was really written by David. And that's actually a very important psalm because Jesus uses it as a teaching moment. He asks the Pharisees, this is in Matthew 22, starting at verse 44. Jesus asked the Pharisees, who is the Messiah going to be? Who do you think the Messiah will be? And they answered, well, he's going to be the son of David. And Jesus says, but if that's true, then why does David call him Lord? Because in Psalm 110, David starts it by saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool. And Jesus is making the point that, okay, maybe the Messiah is going to be an earthly descendant of David, but he's got to be much, much more than that because David actually calls him Lord. And that never happens where a parent or a grandparent or great-great-great-great-grandparent would call the younger one, their younger descendant, Lord. So there's more going on there. But in saying this, Jesus affirmed that this psalm, at least, was definitely written by David. But I digress. Two of the psalms were written by Solomon. We also have 10 psalms written by some people who are known as the sons of Korah. And now this I find very interesting because Korah was someone who appeared in the books of Moses, in Numbers, chapter 16. If you read through Numbers 16, it talks about Korah's rebellion. Korah was someone who was pretty high up in Israelite society from when they were in Egypt. And after Moses led them out of Egypt, Korah and some of his mates basically formed an uprising saying, why should we listen to Moses? What's so special about him? And because he did that, God had the earth open up and swallowed up Korah and his household. Because he wasn't really just rejecting Moses, he was rejecting God's authority because God had placed Moses over his people. And so Korah is sort of a cautionary tale of what happens if you reject God, if you reject God's authority. And yet his descendants, so those in his family who survived this catastrophe, they would go on in later years to write songs of praise to God. And it shows us that it doesn't matter where we come from. It doesn't matter what our family history is. Each of us has the choice to give our lives to God, to trust in God, to give our abilities back to God. And so these descendants of Korah took the God-given gift they had to write songs and they gave it back to him. They were not defined by what their ancestor Korah had done. Then we have 12 psalms written by someone named Asaph, and then one each by two people named Heman the Ezrahite and Ethan the Ezrahite. Now we don't know a whole lot about who these people are, but they are mentioned in 1 Chronicles. So in 1 Chronicles chapter 6, so starting in verse 31, talks about the men that David put in charge of the service of song in the house of the Lord. Most of these coming verses are just genealogies, but it talks about, in verse 33, Heman, who would be Heman the Ezrahite, and then verse 39 lists Asaph, who wrote 12 of the Psalms, and finally down in verse 44, Ethan. He was the other Ezrahite. So these people who wrote the Psalms were contemporaries of David that he valued so highly that he put them in charge of worshiping God in music. And then, as I said, there's lots of other people that lots of other psalms that we don't know exactly who wrote them, but those are the individuals that we do know. And then we move along to Proverbs. The Proverbs were most likely collected by King Solomon, David's son, and many of them were Proverbs that he himself would have written. But he also put in other collected sayings from other people. And part of it, one of the collections, is the sayings of wise men. And it doesn't say who these wise men are, but it's interesting that in 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 31, when it talks about how wise Solomon was, say he's even wiser than all the other wisest men at the time, 3 of the men that are listed as being among the most wise are the ones we just talked about: Asaph, Heman, and Ethan. So they weren't just good songwriters, good musicians, but they were also counted to be among the wisest people alive at the time of King David and his son Solomon. In the Proverbs, a lot of them were also written by a man named Agur, son of Jacob, and we don't really know anything about him at all other than his name. But then also some of the Proverbs were written by someone named King Lemuel. Now, King Lemuel was not an Israelite king. He was probably a North Arabian prince who would have lived in about the same area where Job had lived. And again, this is showing that respect for God is not limited to the Israelites, but that there were people still in other parts of the world that had a great respect for God and understood who he was. So we move along then to Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon, both of which are traditionally believed to have been written by Solomon. And those are all the books of wisdom. Before we move on, I think it's worth noting that even though Solomon was wise, that he collected the Proverbs, he wrote some of the Psalms, he wrote probably Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon, that his life did not end well, that God gave him more wisdom than any other person who had ever lived. And yet Solomon still turned away from God. He ended up worshipping the idols of his many, many, many wives. I think Solomon is a real cautionary tale that it doesn't matter how much God blesses us, how great the gifts are that he gives to us, that we still need to worship him and only him, and not be distracted by the temptations of this world. Or else we could end up as Solomon did, someone who started out very close to God, who just moved further and further and further and further away during the course of his life. And come next to the books of the prophets, and they make up the rest of the Old Testament. There's quite a few of them. And actually, at this point, I had wanted to say something quickly about what Old Testament prophecy actually is, or what prophecy itself actually is. But as I started to think out and write down what I wanted to say, I realized that there's so much ground to cover that it really deserves its own video. So, this is an advert for next season of Ask a Pastor. We will start out with a video that answers the question of what is biblical prophecy, because it might not be exactly what you expect it to be. But we don't have time to go into that now. We'll look at that in January. So the Old Testament prophets are broken down into 2 major groups. You've got minor prophets, which are the next few books in the Bible, and then the minor prophets. So the major prophets and the minor prophets, they're called that not because of the quality of their prophecy, but it has to do with how long their writings are. So the major prophets are those that wrote a lot, and then the minor prophets have very, very short writings. And the first major prophet is Isaiah. He is named as the son of Amos, And that's important. The fact that his father's name is given indicates that he probably comes from a distinguished family. That, in other words, is sort of a old world sort of name dropping. You say who you're related to so that people will sit up and pay attention. Now, Isaiah was influential in the court of the kings of Judah, and he had a place of honor even when the things that he had to say were not particularly popular. He worked with King Hezekiah to bring about religious reform in Judah, and he helped to return the nation to the worship of God. Because the nation of Judah sort of went up and down, where sometimes they'd worship God, and then other times they'd worship idols, and other times they'd worship God, and other times worship idols. And Isaiah was there for one of these peaks with Hezekiah, where they got the people to worship God again. But as soon as Hezekiah was gone, his son Manasseh just went right downhill and encouraged people to worship foreign gods and idols instead. And so Jeremiah saw all the work that he and Hezekiah had done really sort of crumble before his eyes. And so he started to prophesy very fervently about what would happen. That he knew that when the people turned away from God, that God would come and bring judgment on them. And so he prophesied about that. But he didn't just prophesy about how Jerusalem would fall and how his people would be taken into exile in Babylon. He also prophesied hope, that God had a plan to restore his people to him. So it wasn't all doom and gloom, that there's light at the end of the tunnel in Isaiah's writings. But Isaiah himself was martyred during the reign of Manasseh because the king just did not want to hear what it is that he had to say. And Hebrews, in the New Testament, Hebrews 11, verse 37, might be a reference to the way in which Isaiah was killed, if you want to look that up. Next we have the books of Jeremiah and Lamentations. And these were both written most likely by the prophet Jeremiah. The book Jeremiah almost definitely was written by Jeremiah. Lamentations is traditionally believed to come from him. But there's not quite as much proof, but it matches up really well with his personality and his other writings. Now, Jeremiah came from a priestly family. He started his ministry during the reign of King Josiah. And Josiah was the great reformer. He really turned back to God, and he cleansed the nation of all idol worship. He did it better than any other king before him, going all the way back to David. So Isaiah was at the time of Hezekiah the reformer. That was about 100 years before Jeremiah. Jeremiah was at the reign of Josiah, the great reformer. But here's the thing, that Jeremiah, even though he originally started to prophesy at the time of this reforming king, he still wasn't very popular with the other priests, because he pointed out very vocally things that the priests were doing which were not part of God's plan. And he called them out, so that when, after Josiah's death, the Jews turned away from God again, they also rejected Jeremiah. And in fact, Jeremiah was banned from the temple, so that when the word of the Lord came to him that he wanted to share with the people, he couldn't go to the temple himself, so he had to send his scribe in to read the message that he had received from God to the people. And when the nation of Babylon came and laid siege to Jerusalem, just as Isaiah had prophesied that it would 100 years before, Jeremiah encouraged the Israelites, those that were in Jerusalem at the time, to surrender, to go peacefully with the Babylonians, because he knew that the judgment that Babylon had brought was coming from God. And so when Babylon did take Jerusalem, they were very well disposed towards Jeremiah, because he had been telling the people to just surrender. And so the Babylonians offered to bring Jeremiah with them back to Babylon really as an honored guest. They offered to give him a high position with a very generous allowance to live on for the rest of his life. But Jeremiah decided not to go. He decided that he would rather stay in Judea so he could minister to those people that were left behind. Because when Babylon came and took a nation into exile, it didn't take every person from that nation. What they would do is they would only take the people that were the most influential, from the most important families, had the most important jobs. Really, the idea was that they take enough of the upper class and higher middle class of a country away from the country so that there weren't people left really to lead the country. They just sort of left people that would be manual laborers, and they kind of what we call today brain drain, where one country takes and attracts all of the most educated, the most promising people from one country and bring them over into another, leaving the other one depleted. And Jeremiah didn't want to go with those that were deemed worthy enough to be brought into exile. He wanted to stay and minister to everyone else that was left behind. But what happened is that some of these Israelites that were left behind at one point kidnapped Jeremiah and fled into Egypt with him, and he eventually died in Egypt. And that leads us... I've preached on Jeremiah fairly recently, and I preached about how he most likely suffered from clinical depression. And I find him a very, very fascinating prophet, a very fascinating man of God. If you're interested in hearing more and you haven't heard that sermon, I'll put a link to it in the description below. Which brings us to Ezekiel. Ezekiel was also of a priestly family, and he was taken into exile in Babylon, and it was there in Babylon that he ministered to God's people. Ezekiel is what we probably today would call an eccentric. That he did some crazy things. At one point, he lay on his side for more than a year, sort of as a visual prophecy, a visual symbol of God's judgment on Israel and Judah. He's the one who had these really signs of the heavenly realm, of wheels spinning within wheels, of the cherubim. He had the vision of the dry bones coming together and reforming themselves into bodies and gaining flesh and coming back to life. The sort of things that he did and said, the sort of things that if someone in our local church were to start doing them, we would probably take a wide berth around that person and maybe humor them a little bit, but try not to be associated too closely with them. And I think that's a really important lesson to us, is that just because someone seems eccentric to us does not mean that that person is not speaking God's truth. Now, we need to be very careful to judge people not by the outward appearance, not by whether they fit in with the rest of society, but are the things that they're speaking, are they truth? Do they resonate with the truth that we have from God's word? And then finally, the last major prophet that we have is Daniel. Now, Daniel, we know that Daniel wrote it because, again, Jesus affirms that. In Matthew 24, verses 15, Jesus plainly says that part of the passage that he quotes was written by Daniel, and I trust Jesus more than anyone else. But Daniel was a young man who came from an important Judean family, so that when the Judeans were taken into exile, along with Ezekiel, at the time that Jeremiah decided he would stay behind, Daniel was a young man who was taken and then trained to be part of the civil service in Babylon. And Daniel remained true to God even in a hostile environment. And so God raised him up to a position of power, first in the Babylonian Empire, but then once the Persians took over Babylon, he had a position of great power in the Persian Empire as well. And the book of Daniel is an interesting mix of the personal accounts of Daniel's life and how he got to where he was, and how his faith in God really helped him to advance in his civil service. But it's also mixed in with visions that Daniel had of the future. Particularly had visions of a son of man, or one like a son of man, that many people associate with Jesus Christ, who called himself the Son of Man. And it's very interesting that in chapter 4 of Daniel is a text that was written by King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, who had taken Judah into exile, that he had this experience of being humbled and brought up again by God that made him learn to respect and trust and honor God. And chapter 4 of Daniel really is the written testimony of King Nebuchadnezzar, of how he came to put his faith in God. So most of Daniel was written by Daniel, but one chapter was actually written by King Nebuchadnezzar himself. So that brings us now to the minor prophets. I'm not going to spend as much time talking about them, partly because some of them we don't really know too much about. But I'll just say that I believe that each of these books, these small books in the Bible, the minor prophets, were written by the men that they're named after. I don't think there's any reason to really doubt the authenticity of the person that is named as the author of them. But who are they? The details that I think are worth noting, I'll mention here now. So the first minor prophet we have is Hosea. And Hosea came from Israel, the northern kingdom. You may remember I've mentioned how after the time of Solomon, the kingdom split, and you had the northern kingdom of Israel and then the southern kingdom of Judea that had Jerusalem, where the temple was. And now Hosea came from Israel, and he had the extraordinary experience of God telling him to marry a woman that God knew was going to be unfaithful to him. And then after this woman was unfaithful to him, God told Hosea to go and to take her back, to forgive her, to make her his wife again. And the reason that God had him do this, poor chap, is because it was a symbol, a living symbol of God's relationship to his people, that as his people, Israel, had turned away from God. They'd been unfaithful. They'd been whoring themselves with the false gods of the other nations. And yet, God still wanted to reconcile with his people. He's willing to forgive and take them back and make his people his own bride again. The next minor prophet is Joel, but we don't really know anything about him or even when he lived. So we'll move on to Amos. And Amos was probably poor, from an insignificant family. In fact, he was just a shepherd. And although he was from Judah, the southern kingdom, he was called by God to prophesy to the northern kingdom of Israel. So you have to understand exactly how hard it would have been for him to do what he did. Not only was he poor, uneducated, completely unimportant socially, but he actually went into another country, another nation, one that wasn't always friendly, and started to tell them that God's judgment was about to come upon them. This would have taken an incredible amount of courage to stand up to another nation coming from nowhere, no background, no credentials, just the word of God. And I think it's a great testimony to us that God can use every single one of us. It absolutely does not matter what our background is. Doesn't matter whether we've got the right credentials, the right experience, that come from the right family, have enough money, come from the right country. God can use everyone. God can use you, no matter what your background is. If you're willing to go where God is calling you, then He will use you for His glory. We come to Obadiah then, and again, we don't really know much about Obadiah, so we'll move quickly past him. And we come to Jonah. Jonah is probably the best known of the prophets simply because of his misadventure with the whale. But interestingly, Jonah's book is less about the prophetic message that God had given him and more about his reluctance to deliver that message. And it wasn't because he was a coward. I know a lot of people think that is the message of Jonah, and it's not. Jonah wasn't scared to go to Nineveh. He didn't want to go to Nineveh because he didn't want God to be merciful. Jonah knew that God is a merciful God. He knew that if someone or if a nation repents, that God will forgive that person or that nation. And Jonah really wanted Nineveh to be punished. And so he decided he just wouldn't deliver the message so that they would get God's punishment. And God showed him that you can't manipulate God that way. Now we have after Jonah is Micah. Micah was a prophet who lived at the same time as Isaiah. So remember, this is about 100 years before Jerusalem fell and they went into exile. But interestingly, whereas Isaiah came from a very important family and was right at home in the royal court, Micah, his family's not even named, probably because, like Amos, he was a nobody, came from nowhere. And where Isaiah had an urban ministry right there in Jerusalem, in the capital, near the king and his court, Micah had a rural ministry out in the countryside. And you just see that there's not one right calling, that God needs people witnessing, speaking truth to power in the halls of power, but He also needs people out in the streets, out in the villages, talking to everyday people as well. It's just as important for one person to receive God's message as another, because there is no distinction in God's eyes. And we have Nahum, Habakkuk, and we don't know much about them. Zephaniah, just like Jeremiah, Zephaniah was a prophet during the time of Josiah. Remember, he was the really great reformer who lived just before things really turned south, just before Nebuchadnezzar came and took the Judeans into exile. But unlike Jeremiah, who was really young at the time that Josiah began to reign, Zephaniah was an old man at that time. So he sort of handed on the baton to Jeremiah. Now the last three prophets in the Old Testament are Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And these three, they were prophets in Judea after the Jews returned from exile to Palestine. They went back to Judea, to Jerusalem, along with Ezra and Nehemiah that I talked about last time. And Ezra, in the book of Ezra, mentions both Haggai and Zechariah as being there present as part of their ministry. So their prophecies really to inspire people to turn back to really wholeheartedly turn back to God, to take the rebuilding of the temple seriously, to trust God, to dedicate themselves and their land to the God who had brought them up out of exile. And so we see, looking at, I think it's 5 videos that we've done, looking at the people that wrote the books of the Bible, we've got all sorts. that you have a doctor who wrote some of the books of the Bible, a Pharisee, tax collector, you have kings, you have shepherds, musicians, priests, prophets, civil servants. I'm sure I'm missing out plenty. There's all sorts of people that came together to write the books that we've put together, or have been put together, into what we call the Bible. And I think there's two wonderful things that we can take from that. And the first is just the fact that these very different people coming from very different backgrounds, spread out across hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, all present God as a loving, merciful God who wants to forgive, who insists on forgiving, even when we don't, especially when we don't deserve it, and even sometimes when we don't seem to even want it. But it's one consistent message, even though all these different types of people came together to write their own, really their own version of faith, that it is all one faith. But it also shows that God uses all sorts of people. And whoever you are, whatever your background is, God wants to use you. Not to write scripture, that's already done. But there's so much more to God's plan. There are so many things going on right now. And whoever you are, whatever your background is, God has a perfect place to fit you into that plan. You just have to follow his call. Be willing to go where he'd like you to go. So I do hope that this has been interesting to you, and I hope you have a lovely Advent season, a wonderful Christmas, and I look forward to picking things up again sometime in January. God bless.